What is Riverdale? Riverdale is a television show that debuted in 2017. The show began as a teenage drama, and while it always featured crime and mystery elements, it eventually grew to include the supernatural and fantasy. Riverdale is a part of the CW, a television company also responsible for Gossip Girl, The Vampire Diaries, 90210, The Flash, Jane the Virgin, Crazy Ex-Girlfriend, Supernatural, One Tree Hill, and like 5 bazillion other television shows of varying quality. While the CW has a remarkable breadth of shows, it's best known for semi-trashy yet endlessly watchable dramas. When it debuted, Riverdale, which is a gritty high school drama adaptation of the Archie comics, received positive reviews. People liked it for what it was. A show about hot people and murder and high school, not unlike a faster-paced, worse-looking, less thoughtful Twin Peaks. Now, however, Riverdale is known for having gone off the rails. The monologues are cringy, the plot points are insane and hard to follow. Archie got attacked by a bear before failing the SATs.
Bro, I'm warning you. You don't want to start with me.
Dude, what the hell happened? How'd you get those scars?
I was attacked by a bear.
What? You serious? You were attacked by a friggin' bear?
There are multiple cult plots.
Come with me peacefully, or so help me, I will shoot you in the kneecaps and drag your ass out of here myself.
In the latest season, the characters develop superpowers, and Satan makes an appearance. Many people call Riverdale the worst thing on television. Its own actors make fun of it, and sometimes seem resentful that they are yoked to this insane, fast-moving, nearly unwatchable show. And, in my opinion, current video essays on Riverdale, while giving a good historical background of its coming into being, don't do any interesting analysis of the show itself. It's true that Riverdale is so bad it's good, but I feel like there's something deeper that you can say about Riverdale. I feel, in fact, that Riverdale has something to say about all other television, about, in fact, much of the media we consume today. Riverdale is many things. It's funny, stupid, ridiculous, grueling, sometimes really boring and hard to watch, but I believe Riverdale is also a postmodern masterpiece. And in the course of this essay, I will explain the definition of postmodernism, connect a few of its central markers to Riverdale, and show you how they shape the show. Then I will argue that postmodern Riverdale is genius for the way in which it deconstructs the tropes, genres, and forms it works within. So sit back, put on your beanie, pop on the VHS tapes, and please enjoy Riverdale, a masterpiece of television. I do need to give a fuller definition of postmodernism, which is hard because it began life as a contentious term and continues to be a contentious term, as well as being deeply misunderstood by the general populace. So let's consult the Oxford Dictionary of Literary Terms. In its simplest and least satisfactory sense, postmodernism refers generally to the phase of 20th century Western culture that succeeded the reign of high modernism. More often, though, it is applied to a cultural condition prevailing in the advanced capitalist societies since the 1960s, characterized by a superabundance of disconnected images and styles, most noticeably in television, advertising, commercial design, and pop video. Postmodernity is said to be a culture of fragmentary sensations, eclectic nostalgia, disposable simulacra, and promiscuous superficiality, in which the traditionally valued qualities of depth, coherence, meaning, originality, and authenticity are evacuated or dissolved amid the random swirl of empty signals. That's a lot in that definition, so let's try to isolate a few key variables of postmodern art here, both from the definition and from Frederick Jameson's book Postmodernism. 1. Lack of meta-narrative. 2. Pastiche. 3. Deconstruction. 4. Post-World War II and probably post-60s. 5. Late capitalism, i.e. multinational or global capitalism. 6. Disconnection and fragmentation. 7. Images and superficiality. 8. No more high art versus low art. And 9. Simulacra. If you don't know what something on this list means, hold tight. If it's important to this essay, I promise I will explain it. So, if I were to ask you what you think a postmodern piece of art is, what would you say? James Joyce? Duchamp? The Futurists? Look at the list. those are not postmodern. They are modernists. It's not just the post-60s criteria which helps us make that distinction, but also the recognition that Joyce, Duchamp, and the Futurists did have depth or intention to their work. They were also high culture and high art. And they were also not working under global capitalism. And you can see those differences reflected in their work versus postmodern art. So then the natural question is, what is postmodern art? Well, it's some buildings, some novels that really suck to read. According to Jameson, MTV is postmodern. Okay, look, he was writing about postmodernism in the 90s when MTV was still a thing. In my opinion, TikTok is postmodern. Think about it. Think about the variables on our list. TikTok is literally just a series of disconnected sounds taken from their original source, given a different meaning or meme format, then disconnected from that original meme format and appropriated into someone else's meme, ad nauseum, all done by people you don't know, for free, for a company to make a gazillion dollars off of it. TikTok is quite literally a flow of disconnected images and sounds, intentionally and openly superficial and fragmented. The same can be argued of other social media. Much television, too, is postmodern in my humble opinion. It at least can be usefully analyzed through the lens of postmodernism. Think, for example, about the inherent fragmentation that goes into making cinema or TV. Shots are filmed out of order and repeatedly, with different shots being pieced together to make one scene. This too plays into the simulacra that is television and film. It must hide the very process which made it, position the camera such that none of the filming machinery can be seen, appear to have happened as if it were real life even though the real life process of filming is being obscured. Multinational capitalism is the driver of television and cinema, and the golden age of television, arguably still happening, takes a large part in the effacing of the boundary between high and low culture. A ton of people from all walks of life have seen the greatest TV shows of all time, which can't be said of the great art of, for example, modernism, which consisted of novels that were difficult to read and poems only a select elite could understand. Despite all of their differences, every episode of Riverdale has one thing in common. That is the use of pastiche. So, what is pastiche? Pastiche is a work composed from elements borrowed from various other writers. The term can be used in a derogatory sense to indicate lack of originality, or more neutrally to refer to works that involve a deliberate and playfully imitative tribute to other writers. And there's more to that definition, but we'll get to that later. You probably already know about parody, pastiche's more famous cousin. When SNL imitates or borrows, it does so for the sake of parody, that is, to make fun. SNL, for example, imitates the setup of the presidential debate stage, the animations that play before the debate, the clothes, appearances, and voices of the candidates, and the events of the debate to ultimately mock them. While pastiche can be harder to identify in the wild, it, like parody, is also incredibly common. Think of pastiche as parody without the bite. Parody that stops short of making a joke and instead imitates for other purposes. The imitation is often done in admiration of a particular mode, genre, or writer. Pastiche and parody can often find overlap, as in RuPaul's Drag Race, which imitates America's Next Top Model with both admiration and an eye for the humor inherent in the reality competition show. And if you wanted an example of straight pastiche, you could point to Carry On by Rainbow Rowell, a straightforward, fairly uncritical pastiche of the Harry Potter series. How do you differentiate between genre and pastiche? After all, is it pastiche when someone writes a mystery novel and it has a hard-boiled detective, a damsel in distress, a series of suspects, and twists and turns? No, it's genre, so how can we tell the difference? Genre is a recognizable and established category of written work employing such common conventions as will prevent readers or audiences from mistaking it for another kind. Genre is sometimes a confusingly broad term, since it can include art forms with strict rules, or relatively flexible forms like the novel, which then itself spawns multiple subgenres, which it's probably what you're thinking of when you hear the word genre, right? Like the science fiction novel, the fantasy novel, the romance novel, or the werewolf and vampire novel. Pastiche is an imitation of a mode, a genre, or a specific work of art or an artist. It is, simply put, the usage of a genre's trappings in a non-genre piece. If, for example, one is watching a movie that uses mystery genre tropes, characters, and plot devices from beginning to end, that movie falls within the mystery genre. However, if a movie uses all these devices for, let's say, 5 minutes, simply to play around with the mystery genre before dropping that style, that is pastiche. And again, it's helpful to remember that pastiche and parody are joined at the hip. It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia often employs a mixture of pastiche and parody in its episodes. It adjusts the plot, the cinematography, even the form of its episodes to play with genre. After the episode, or in some cases the scene, the show drops the genre it had only just employed and moves on to another. That's what makes it pastiche and not genre. The show is using generic devices not to be recognizable as a specific genre to work within the form, but instead to warp the genre, to question it, to make it funny, to imitate it, to try its hand at being a courtroom drama, or an adventure or a road trip film, and then to cast it aside and try something else. Okay, you can probably think of a lot of pastiche that goes hand in hand with parody, as I just described it in SNL or in Always Sunny. But can you think of any completely, purely parody-free pastiche? It does exist. You just have to be on the lookout for it. Season 1 of Riverdale most obviously imitates Twin Peaks, which itself follows a tradition of high school dramas, ensemble cast soap operas, and murder mysteries. At the same time, Twin Peaks cultivates an eerie atmosphere that sets it apart from the rest. It is this atmosphere of mystery, intrigue, the FBI, the haunted rural, drugs, prostitutes, abuse, and the supernatural all hiding under the Pacific veneer of an idyllic small town that really makes Twin Peaks. It is this atmosphere, along with much of Twin Peaks' content, that Riverdale explicitly imitates. You can see Riverdale's pastiche of Twin Peaks in the pine trees, the floating corpse, the high school romance, the interweaving of plot lines concerning very different players in the town, like the adults and the kids. So, okay, there's a lot of Twin Peaks in Riverdale, and it's known that the showrunner of Riverdale drew from Twin Peaks. Some episode titles and characters even explicitly reference Twin Peaks. One could simply call Riverdale a worse, cheesier version of Twin Peaks. Would that be an accurate thing to say? Also, doesn't this undermine my own definition of pastiche if Riverdale is imitating Twin Peaks the whole time? Would that instead maybe push it into the territory of genre? We are on the border of pastiche in season 1, but it's not becoming the overwhelming focus of the show yet. In fact, Riverdale is working within a soapy murder mystery high school genre that, while sort of strange, is certainly not unique. It is difficult to understand when Riverdale jumps the shark and goes from being a normal mediocre TV show to an interestingly bizarre one. The easy answer is that it does this several times, sometimes multiple times in one episode, which is also not a helpful answer. The weirdnesses of Riverdale arguably begin in episode 1, when Cheryl and her twin brother are filmed as if they are lovers.
That you'll kiss me forever.
On the 4th of July, just after dawn, Jason and Cheryl Blossom drove out to Sweetwater River for an early morning boat ride.
Are you scared, Jason?
But one moment stands out to me in the beginning of season 2, actually the first episode of season 2. Archie's dad has just been shot during an armed robbery at Pop's chocolate shop. Archie has rushed him to the hospital, and his girlfriend Veronica makes him go home and shower to de-stress. Archie doesn't know whether his dad is going to survive, if he'll have horrible injuries even if he does survive. He doesn't know where his dad's attempted murderer is now, if he's coming back to finish the job. He steps into the shower, and then... It's not simply these two characters having sex that doesn't make sense in this moment. There is a way to film this scene. How does sex look during moments of heightened stress? Does Archie cry during or after? Does he reject Veronica's sexual advances, causing problems in their relationship? Is the sex really rough, or maybe uncanny and creepy, or just sad? No, it's normal Riverdale softcore pornography. Same acting, same music, same direction. the kind we saw in season 1 and see a lot of later. Surgically inserted into an irrelevant moment. No, not just an irrelevant moment, an antithetical moment. The progression of events does not track, except for the fact that, this is Riverdale, which means it's a steamy teen drama with sex, so there has to be sex. And so they have normal sex, even though it doesn't make sense. It is a sex scene that could happen anywhere else in the show, even though Archie's dad might die and a murderer is on the loose. We see this fragmentation in season 1, too. Cheryl is a girl in mourning, or a stereotypical cool girl bitch, but despite there being a relatively simple way to thread the two together, Riverdale doesn't fully make it work. It tries, and we have characters like Veronica mention that Cheryl must be acting so mean because she's sad, but we don't really see this played out in a way that makes sense. Cheryl oscillates between the two roles of mourner and high school cool girl with the same tonal deafness that makes the Archie and Veronica sex scene so jarring. Riverdale is patchy, it's fragmented. And remember, fragmentation is a characteristic of postmodernism. As Riverdale progresses, the jumpy, jarring, noticeably out-of-place pastiche becomes more frequent and more disruptive to a quote-unquote normal viewing experience. Jughead is switching high schools, while Kevin is trying to hook up with random men by wandering around a forest late at night. Veronica has a spat with her parents over whether she can have people over on a school night, but the added complexity is that her dad is a mobster who's just gotten back from prison. Archie's music teacher, the one he had sex with, has just been murdered, and after the attempt on the life of his dad, Archie is freaking out because he believes that somebody is trying to kill the people he cares about. His friends do not respond empathetically.
But can we at least agree now that there's a killer on the loose?
Terrible aim.
Jughead, he murdered Miss Grundy.
Arch, we don't know that these 3 crimes are related.
Guys, can we focus on what matters here? Midge and Moose are alive. Archie's dad survived. The new season of The Bachelorette starts tonight.
Veronica tells Archie to chill out because, it's not a big deal. Archie's dad is alive, so who cares about the attempted murder? And also, the new season of The Bachelorette starts tonight. These seemingly inexcusable responses from Archie's closest friends, who know there's an active serial killer on the loose in their small town, show exactly what Riverdale is doing here. How can Riverdale both be a lighthearted teen drama and a dark coming-of-age story, and a story about gangs and drug dealing, and also a story about growing up gay? This is a problem a lot of ensemble cast teen shows face. Twin Peaks handles it by making the lighter issues, like crushes or the antics of side characters, either subtler or funnier. Euphoria does this by taking everything up to a level of seriousness. A teenager can't just explore her newfound sexual confidence with hookups or nudes, but she has to do kinky cam work. Everything's heightened. Gossip Girl employs a mixture of both tonal awareness and a dramatic heightening of certain common high school problems. But unlike these other shows, Riverdale doesn't care about creating an internal logic or a tonal consistency. Of the many topics it wants to address, it does them at the level it wants, on its own terms, abandoning the train of thought when it's bored, forcing tone or mood, inserting this or that pastiche seemingly when the screenwriters or showrunner watch a new movie or TV show they like. There is no consideration for the past events in the show, no worry about the future events, no concern about whether something is going to be internally consistent in Riverdale. It is and I'm using this term not clinically, not derogatorily, but in the same way Frederick Jameson uses it in postmodernism, following Lacan's teachings, it is a schizophrenic show. Pastiche is why it's a schizophrenic show. Riverdale wants to be a million TV shows at once. It wants to be a superhero show. It wants to be a show about cults. It wants to be a show about gay people. It wants to be a show about witches. It wants to be a show about high school football. It wants to be a show about the inhumanity of prisons. It wants to be about creativity in writing. It wants to be about psychopaths. It wants to be a Bildungsroman. It wants to be The Godfather. And it tries to be all of those things, usually for about 15 minutes before giving it up. So we know pastiche is entrenched in Riverdale. It is a fragmented show as a result. Let's jump to season 4 and fully analyze an episode of Riverdale to understand what pastiche does to the show. Season 4, Episode 6, or Chapter 63, per Riverdale's own numbering conventions, is titled Hereditary. In the recap for this episode, we see that Cheryl and her girlfriend Tony think a ghost is living inside a doll in their house. Archie is running a Big Brothers Big Sisters type program for kids in a bad neighborhood. Jughead is trying to solve a mystery about his grandfather. Betty is stalking her half-brother Charles, who is in the FBI and whom she suspects to be a serial killer. Veronica's mysterious half-sister, whom she didn't know about until now, has arrived to start a rum business in Riverdale. Oh, and as a result of Archie's charity for vulnerable youth, Archie is now a target of a local Dickensian gun-wielding criminal and has been doling out vigilante justice in his free time while wearing a mask. A lot of these scenes are just characters talking, but they also all feel as if they're being pulled from different television shows. And if you've been paying attention while I recap what happens in each of these scenes, you'll understand why. While the quick movement between several plot threads is common in an ensemble cast show like White Lotus, you'll also notice when watching White Lotus that it's not like one character is possessed, another one is chasing a serial killer, another one is feuding with a criminal kingpin, and then they're also doing normal resort stuff. The problems the characters face in White Lotus adhere to a certain internal logic that allows them to then be drawn together. This is even true in Riverdale's sister show, Sabrina the Teenage Witch. I mentioned Sabrina because, unlike White Lotus, it's an ensemble cast show with supernatural elements, and fantasy as well, but even in the first season there is a logic to the events, or at least more logic than we have in Riverdale. To be clear, this could be a critique in terms of an area where I think Riverdale could improve, but it's not at all for my purposes in this video. Rather, here I have performed this quick analysis of less than a quarter of an episode of Riverdale to demonstrate the jumpy jumble of pastiche that the show is. The puzzle pieces don't fit together, and the individual plot lines pull from genres with no criticism or parody or commentary. It's hard to remember what happens not only because the show moves so quickly, but also because there is no grounding logic. There's no way in which these events connect to each other. Anything could happen. We could be thrown into a murder mystery, a forbidden romance, a lighthearted musical, a satire of the upper class, a drug-dealing plot, a family drama, a family comedy, and all of those things and way more do happen. When the main characters interact, it feels ungrounded because they are living in what amounts to different TV shows. By making Betty patiently listen to Jughead talk about his boring mystery plot, it further fragments her character, splits her between the preppy boarding school pastiche and the FBI serial killer evil in the family pastiche. The same thing happens when Archie and Veronica interact. So, what is the effect of this use of pastiche? There are two. It deconstructs the genres or references being pastiched. It also deconstructs Riverdale itself, and, on a wider level, the medium of television. To explain this ambitious claim, I must first define deconstruction. Again, I can only go so deep here, so I really encourage anyone confused or interested to watch some YouTube videos about deconstruction. Jacques Derrida, a seminal French philosopher, came up with the concept of deconstruction. Anytime you hear someone say money is a construct or gender is a construct, you basically have Derrida to thank. His ideas totally changed our world. When someone says money is a construct, they're not arguing money isn't real or money doesn't have an impact on our lives. Rather, they're saying money is something we as a society have chosen to attach importance to. It's a stand-in, basically, for value or work. A useful stand-in, one we can use to make our day-to-day lives much easier, but without our society as it's structured, money has no importance. If you drop a dollar bill into Caveman's hands, he can't do anything with it, and it means absolutely nothing to him. So, money is then a construct, because it's something which needs the surrounding society to have meaning. Deconstruction is the process by which someone tries to break down a societal understanding or assumption, a construct, in order to better comprehend it. Sometimes this also involves the aim of removing that construct, but it definitely does not always. Let's say someone tells me it is good for children to learn to play an instrument, and I want to deconstruct that belief. I would probably ask things like, why is it good? What makes something worth doing, especially as a child? What privileges learning to play an instrument over other things, like learning a language? What makes learning at all good? Most children won't be very talented at playing instruments, and many of them won't enjoy it, so isn't that a negative side effect? What are the societal and historical reasons we think learning an instrument is beneficial? Do they have to do with ideas of classical schooling, the way wealthy children were raised, Renaissance ideals? Surely the idea that children ought to learn an instrument does not just come out of nowhere. Even if it feels like it logically follows that children ought to learn an instrument, that idea comes from a long and storied historical background that's tied up with things like the elite non-working class before the development of modern capitalism, the development of modern capitalism in the bourgeois class, assumptions regarding young minds and education, and even the way parties and entertaining worked before recorded music. Doing this intellectual work doesn't mean I think it's bad to learn an instrument as a child. Rather, it means trying to disassociate the cultural baggage that comes along with a statement from the statement itself. And every statement has cultural baggage. Yes, every statement. In fact, part of what Derrida argues is that every word has cultural baggage. That's not bad, it's just the way words work. Earlier I made the claim that the effect of pastiche in Riverdale is deconstructive. I said it deconstructed two things: the genres and the stories it was using as pastiche, and itself as a TV show. Let's return to Season 4, Episode 6. Our pastiches in this episode include an FBI and serial killer thriller, which is combined with a family drama that includes concerns about genetics and inheriting evil, another family drama, this one about creativity and writing, which takes place in a boarding school and includes a critique of the snooty upper class, a story about a different set of snooty upper-class characters, which does not apply that same critique to them, and instead unquestioningly pits two businesswomen against each other in a battle for their father's approval, and a story about a compassionate man's desire to save impoverished children, even though his efforts are drawing the ire of a local criminal and his own mother. The way these storylines interact, or probably better to say fail to interact, deconstructs the points, purposes, or morals of these narratives. For example, what is the point of Betty's narrative arc in this episode? It includes a fear about genetically inheriting the nasty traits of your family members. In the previous episode, Betty is able to recognize serial killers by looking at their pictures because both she and those serial killers have the serial killer gene. Betty is the daughter of a serial killer, and she suspects her half-brother Charles is also a serial killer. All the while, she grapples with flashbacks and homicidal urges that imply she too will succumb to this inherited evil. One of the problems, then, of Betty's storyline is, how do we avoid becoming like our relatives? Is it possible to not make the same mistakes as them, or are we doomed to develop their same weaknesses and neuroses? Jughead's storyline is also about inheritance, but the similarities end there. Jughead suspects, correctly, that his grandfather wrote a novel, but the story was taken from him by rich prep school kids for their personal gain. Jughead's grandfather is not a good person. He's an alcoholic who abandoned his family, for one thing, and Jughead's dad hates the guy. But Jughead isn't concerned at all with inheriting his grandfather's bad traits. For Jughead, proving his grandfather wrote the novel will also perhaps justify his own writing ambitions. So, in this case, family is a source of good inheritance, not evil. The reason Jughead's grandfather is an alcoholic, it turns out, is because the gazillion-dollar novel series was his idea originally, but he sold the first book to the prep school classmate for $5,000. This revelation affirms Jughead's talent, but gives him none of Betty's qualms regarding inheriting alcoholism, commitment issues, or debilitating grudge holding, all of which are traits his grandfather also has, alongside good writing. Another level of incompatibility exists between these two storylines as well. They both ask the question, where does bad come from? And they both come to very different answers. Jughead's grandfather did a bad thing by abandoning his family, and Betty's father did several bad things, mainly killing all those people. But in the Jughead plot, the grandfather's bad actions have a situational explanation, and only a situational explanation. His resentment over losing the rights to his own novel drove him to drinking, which drove him to leave his family. In the Betty plot, her father and half-brother's serial killing have a genetic explanation, and only a genetic explanation. They are serial killers, they just are. They like killing, and that's it. And Betty's worried she also likes killing, and there's nothing that can be done about it. These two views on the origins of evil do not compromise for each other. They do not include each other's viewpoints. There's a way in which they could, but they don't. These undermining processes are all the more obvious when they occur for a singular character. Take Veronica's relationship with her mob boss father, Hiram. Hiram tries to have Veronica's mother killed. He tries to have Archie, Veronica's boyfriend, harmed or killed several times. He personally beats up Archie. He tries to ruin Veronica's businesses and finances several times. And yet, when Hiram divorces Veronica's mother, Veronica is distraught for the sake of their quote-unquote family, even though her mother would clearly be safer without Hiram. Veronica's mother, bafflingly, is also distraught, and for what it's worth, the show claims that this is because, Veronica's mother wouldn't be safe if Hiram divorced her, but I don't know. I just don't buy it. When Hiram gets sick, Veronica spends several episodes worrying about him and trying to coerce him into going to the doctor or being more honest with her. It is really as if in some episodes Hiram is a truly cinematically evil mob boss, irredeemably evil person, and in others he's just a complicated dad, not perfect, not willing to be emotionally vulnerable, sometimes snippy or withdrawn, but ultimately deserving of affection. The pastiche of the true villain in Hiram undercuts the pastiche of the flawed but human father, and vice versa. These tropes undermine each other, they cancel out the ideology of both. Because, to be clear, every trope and genre has an ideology and cultural baggage, just as I earlier said every belief, statement, and word has those things. Stories about flawed fathers have been around for way longer than King Lear, and they often promote the idea that, no matter how horribly your parents act, they are worthy of your compassion even when you must set boundaries with them. They set out a moral. Stories about evil, combative villains set out a different moral. Evil must be fought and stopped at all costs, and no sensible person should have compassion for evil. Action against evil is crucial. These two ideologies are not compatible, at least not in the way that Riverdale plays them against each other. So, while in a normal story, these ideologies individually would feel relevant and compelling, in Riverdale they both feel ridiculous because they're put into the same person. The juxtaposition exposes the ideological underpinnings of both of these tropes and of stories as a whole. So far, we've proven that Riverdale operates with pastiche. It does not modify its pastiches to its storyline, but rather uncritically shoves all of these disparate pastiches together next to each other. The result is a mix of media tropes which normally would have never been caught dead together, and the result of that is deconstruction. Each pastiche disagrees with some other pastiche, but because they are all played straight, as it were, the underlying ideological message of every pastiche is threatened. The viewer must take at least some of the pastiches critically to watch Riverdale, even though the show itself does not posit its own critique of any given pastiche. With many TV shows, we can sit back, relax, and let the TV show tell us what is or isn't moral. Even in shows which play around with moral ambiguity, we can rest easy knowing that the TV show itself places its characters into the morally gray box. But with Riverdale, you have to make your own judgments, regardless of the aesthetic narrative being pushed at you. If in one episode Riverdale tells you X character is bad, unequivocally, and then in the next tells you they're misunderstood and flawed, but ultimately good, which argument do you trust? Ultimately, what a viewer ought to leave Riverdale knowing is not to trust a single thing they see on TV. As a result of this pastiche deconstruction, Riverdale operates with an overarching lack of meta-narrative. So, what is meta-narrative? Lyotard defines postmodernism much more simply than I did earlier. He defines it as a lack of meta-narrative. Meta-narrative is the belief in an overarching historical narrative to the world. Christianity has a meta-narrative. There was a time before Jesus, we're in the time after Jesus, and eventually Jesus will return, and we should act accordingly. Traditional Marxism contains a meta-narrative. All history is defined by class struggles, and eventually those class struggles will birth communism. Modernity, or some parts of it, contained meta-narrative. Either science is allowing us to progress and humanity will only continue to improve, or humanity is failing as evidenced by these world wars and we're all going to die. Postmodern thought, or postmodern art, then, abandons the meta-narrative. The past is neither good nor bad, better or worse. Neither is the present, nor will the future be. Nothing necessarily leads to something else. Just because one thing happens does not imply anything else will or won't happen. We've already seen how there's a lack of cause and effect in Riverdale, both on the level of which pastiche will be introduced, and on the ideological level. The good character in one episode may very well be the bad character in another episode. However, I want to focus on a different sort of meta-narrative. This is an overall lack of internal logic in Riverdale as a TV show. Riverdale, although it is a serious repeat offender, is far from the only TV show to operate with weak or non-existent internal logic. We even have a phrase for weak or violated internal logic in TV shows: jumping the shark. The phrase jump the shark came from television originally, Happy Days if you're wondering, which feels fitting. I mean, where else could it have arrived to us from except that serialized medium so self-conscious about its spot in a grander money-making scheme? Television has to grab us and then never let us go. The alternative is that it could come to terms with its own inevitable demise. Most TV shows have opted to pretend that they will never end, and a lot of them have been ruined or at least besmirched or embarrassed by that choice. Think of The Office. It has good seasons and it has bad seasons because, as people like to say, it didn't end when it should have ended. This happens to a lot of TV shows, especially cash cows. When, as a screenwriter, you are told to make the show for an indefinite period of time, you have a few shortcuts at your disposal. You can postpone the resolution of your plot points and cliffhangers for as long as possible and hope people don't get bored. You can resolve your first conflicts and then introduce new conflicts and hope the audience will care about these new conflicts. One way of making the audience care about these new conflicts is by increasing the stakes from what the conflict was earlier. This often means shark jumping. The CW has a bad habit of doing this. Supernatural, for example, has its characters fighting the devil. Then they've got to fight a guy who's worse than the devil. Then they've got to fight, I think they fight the Void? Anyways, the writers keep coming up with these conflicts that, if this were a movie, would be the end of the movie, but it's not the end of the TV show. You can't fight the devil, then go back to fighting garden variety ghosts. You have to keep saving the world. Marvel has this problem too, and I think some people call it power creep. The reason characters like Hawkeye feel so unimportant in Endgame is because Marvel kept raising the stakes and the powers of its heroes as the movies continued. So the characters who are at the very beginning of the Marvel franchise, they don't seem as powerful later on. Being able to shoot a bow and arrow kind of meant something in the first Marvel movies, but in Endgame it's incredibly inconsequential. This power creep and jumping the shark effect, where both the past and the future of a TV show are ignored for the benefit of its present, is very self-evident in Riverdale. I mean, it's everywhere. The show starts off with normal high school problems, then serial killing, then it includes gangs and drug dealing, then it includes cults, then demons, and now they can travel through time and dimensions. Satan and God are there, the Holy Grail and the spear that Jesus was stabbed with at the crucifixion are involved. This jumping the shark, this lack of internal logic, is also a lack of meta-narrative. Think, for example, of those meta-narratives I mentioned earlier. With Christianity, there is a beginning, clear crisis points in its history, a place for our present, a place for a future crisis point, and an ending. Christianity can't really jump the shark because everything else is contained within the knowledge of these important past events and important future events. Nothing that happens right now can be as important as the crucifixion, unless it's Jesus' return and the beginning of the apocalypse. So everything you do is in that context. You, as a pastor, can't say, actually, something more important than the crucifixion is happening, unless you're literally claiming the second coming is happening. There is a ceiling set by the past and by the future on what can happen, what is the most important. Some TV shows have a meta-narrative built in. I mentioned The Office earlier as a show that suffered from its own inability to end, and that's true, but The Office never really jumps the shark because, well, it's about benign people living benign lives. Pam can't turn out to be a drug addict secretly, according to the meta-narrative of The Office. It just wouldn't make sense. That's not the kind of TV show that it is. On the other hand, anyone in Euphoria could turn out to have been a secret drug addict, because that is the kind of TV show it is. But no one in Euphoria is going to turn out to be a demon in disguise, even though that would be super cool. Explicitly or implicitly, in the writer's room, the writers must decide what could or could not happen in their show. That is a show's meta-narrative. Which events will be the most important of the show? Which events or rules will we never surpass in importance? What must happen and what cannot happen, ever? Think of meta-narrative for a TV show like a graph, on which the importance of a certain thing happening is ranked from 1 to 10. Things numbered 1 through 4 can probably happen whenever in the show's run. Things 5 through 7 may be saved for mid-season drama. Characters should have genuinely shocked or emotional reactions to them. Anything numbered 8, 9, and 10 needs to be intense moments in the show and treated suchly. If something surpasses a 10, it cannot happen in the show. If something is below a 1, it is so unimportant that the show probably wouldn't mention it, or would only mention it briefly. In The Office, an on-screen character we know and remember getting brutally murdered would be like a 20. It just couldn't happen. In Euphoria, it would be an 8. It can't happen a lot, but it could occur in a season finale, and it would have a big impact on all the characters. They'd be talking about it forever. In Game of Thrones, it would probably be a 1. Riverdale totally lacks this meta-narrative. Things which would not have been possible in season 1 actually happen in later seasons. Things which would have mattered a lot in earlier seasons are entirely unimportant in later seasons. Archie has something of an existential crisis in season 1 when he tries to decide between football, music, and his dad's construction business. Archie, considering a career change, would have no place in season 6, since he's fighting a British demon. Similarly, Cheryl wants to exert her total control over her cheerleading squad in season 1. In season 6, she wants to extract a rare mineral called palladium from a haunted mine and redeem her witch ancestor. Riverdale does not just lack this meta-narrative when you compare season to season across the show's years on air. It also stands out between the plot lines of different characters. We touched on a lot of this during the pastiche and deconstruction segments, but remember how odd it felt that one character was dealing with the supernatural, another was trying to find a serial killer, and a third was having trouble adjusting to boarding school? These events were all given equal importance in the amount of airtime they got, the way the characters reacted to them, and the way the aesthetics of the show itself encompassed them. They got the same music, same lighting, same monologues, same dramatic narration, and they are all forgotten as quickly as they've concluded, or I should say almost all. The main exception is Jason's death, which continues to have an impact on Cheryl's character and the show even after that mystery has been resolved. But the other mysteries, the other dramatic 10-level events that happen, like Betty's dad turning out to be a serial killer, and Jughead's sister terrorizing the town, they are forgotten as quickly as they happen. So far, I've introduced you to the theory of postmodern art and its main characteristics. I've made the claim that Riverdale can be considered postmodern. I backed up this claim by delving into the characteristics of postmodernism I feel Riverdale exhibits: the pastiche, fragmentation, deconstruction, and a lack of meta-narrative. It's also worth noting that the other parts of postmodernism, like the privileging of image and surface over meaning and depth, tie into concepts like the pastiche, which can be conceived of as a pure distillation of image and surface. I've also tied these characteristics together by explaining what impact their presence has on the show. For example, the many pastiches Riverdale employs force an absence of meta-narrative on the show. The pastiches also deconstruct each other and, as a result, deconstruct the genres they are based off of. People have pointed out before that Riverdale treats a lot of issues the same, like Archie's being mauled by a bear and Archie failing the SAT. People have also said before that Riverdale is confusing and hard to follow. I myself will sometimes rewatch Riverdale and be shocked by plot lines or scenes I entirely forgot but must have seen. The plots are convoluted and ridiculous, and the characters are unpredictable. Riverdale's postmodern characteristics make it feel like one is being bombarded by TV when one watches it, or more specifically, bombarded by Riverdale. The settings and characters are as flat and unsubtle as possible to more quickly convey the plot to you. Look at this, a sketchy alleyway with literal trash fires. Therefore, this is a dangerous place, and you've got it. Look at this, character does charity work. Therefore, they are a good person, and you've got it. All this shorthand serves to push the plot faster and further, but the plot itself dissolves all too quickly. Riverdale is hyper-fiction in that it desires to shove as much signifier into each scene as possible, making the scenes on their own obvious and preachy, yet within the context of the show disjointed and incompatible and meaningless. The mass of plot with which Riverdale slams us is not itself the point of the show either. So, what is the point? That's the thing. There isn't one. Riverdale is a postmodern masterpiece because it pushes itself so hard, engages with so many different ideas, tries to fit the entire history of television and cinema into its run and its shitty CW aesthetic of weirdly lit rooms, cheesy sets, and badly dressed characters. It reduces all meaningful fiction down to non-meaningful fiction. It deconstructs any TV or film you could hold near and dear, be it mobster movies or romance or high school dramas. Riverdale is a homicidal TV show. It is a TV show that wants to ruin TV for you. It wants to seep into everything. It wants to make you say about some touching or frightening thing that you see in a well-done A24 movie, oh, that happened in Riverdale. It wants to remove all film's magic by reducing all film to fragment and pastiche. And that makes Riverdale the most interesting thing on television right now. It is truly doing something no other piece of media has done at this level before. And that claim sounds crazy, but I believe that, and I hope I've convinced you of that too. Riverdale wants it all. It began by taking out its deconstructive wrath on the Archie comics, and now it takes out its wrath on everything. Nothing is too sacred, too disturbing, too funny, too emotionally compelling, or too true for Riverdale to turn false, trite, or boring. I love Riverdale because Riverdale feels like the beginning of the end of aesthetics. Riverdale stomps on aesthetic meta-narrative left, right, and center. Riverdale is the killer of myths, the destroyer of ideologies, even those ideologies the show itself tries to perpetuate. Nothing can be pastiched by Riverdale and come out whole.